whirling of the mind must be still. The thoughts that arrange the molecules of the mirror of our consciousness need the calmness of a still pool, that we may be able to see clearly. Mankind for centuries, in particular in this age, have had dangled before them the baubles and trinkets of life. These trinkets, these baubles, swinging before our gaze by their hypnotic effect, have deluded and confused the world so that the meaning of love is lost in the strange phantasmagoria of the world whirl. Let us then still our minds, the mirror in which God is reflected, though we have never seen before. If this were our first day on earth, and we came in with a full-blown consciousness of our present moment, we would still require, in order to see the face of God, a clear mirror. For it is we, as an individual, who must perceive God. It is not enough to have His Spirit omnipresent in the world. He is everywhere. We do not necessarily perceive Him in the wind that blows, nor in the temperature changes that affect the weather element, nor do we see God in the faces of those that we meet in many cases. For our consciousness goes to the outer overlay, the errors that require transmutation. There are in this world many hearts hungering and thirsting after righteousness. As man is hungering for mortal bread, so also does his soul hunger for the only thing that can assuage his thirst, and that is the spiritual graces. The spiritual graces that are here and everywhere in the world order. We see them hiding behind the sunbeams in the sky, the play of light and shadow in the clouds, the dancing that takes place in the wind, manifestations of nature. Sadly, we see it also in the alternate manifestations of sickness and health that pervade our world, where man, by reason of his artificiality, his sham and his hypocrisy, has created illusions about life. No, we are not that far apart from each other. Christian and Jew, Negro and white man, Chinese and Indian, all races and all peoples upon the face of this earth are made by one God and made for one purpose, one destiny. The destiny must be grand. It must be noble. It must be worthy. And we, if we will, can be a part of that destiny, or we can deny ourselves that destiny by being enmeshed in the concepts of hatred. For hatred shrivels the soul. Hatred makes small the mind. And the matrices of hatred produce the bane of unhappiness. If we would know God, we must know the meaning of love. Not a love that reaches out to grasp something or someone, but a love that reaches out either to receive or give according to heavenly polarities, that we may become identified with the nature of God. What is the nature of God? The nature of God is spiritual. And we see constantly in airplane wrecks, bus wrecks, and just ordinary living, the dying of the world. Longfellow said, "They have never lived. They can wait to die." Those who have not enjoyed or penetrated beyond enjoyment into the spiritual realms, they have not really lived. Because life does not consist of bowls of jelly and ice cream and world fame and the accumulation of little pieces of gold, pieces of 8, as the pirates would say. Life does not consist of that. We should learn to use the world, not to abuse it. So the saints tell us. And these are not mere visionaries. These are not just people who have lived hypocritically. These are people from whom our age can learn. We can learn from the activities of St. Francis of Assisi and the activities of St. Teresa. We can learn from the activities of Prince Mori Wong of Kokonor. We can learn from the activities of Jesus the Christ. We can learn because these are and were people like ourselves, endowed with a God spark within, who exploited the God spark to its fullest and buoyantly amplified the contents of that inner radiance of the soul until it shone through the mortal form and transcended this mundane life. Sic transit gloria mundi. Thus passes the glory of this world. Kings and poets and prophets and people have lived upon this world, and by the hand of God they have endowed and enriched our civilization. As Rembrandt painted magnificently, as Titian in glowing colors brought to our attention the things of the subtle and fiery world, as Paolo Veronese or Paul the Venetian was able to capture on canvas the fragrance of the sacred fire and the flowers that are spiritual in nature, the immortals which God has made. So may we, if we will, today, now, in the eternal now, reach out, if we will, not with violence, but with cosmic outreach into the far and distant dim past to retrieve those great spiritual treasures that humanity have endowed us with in the name of God. I cannot believe that men who dwelled in the long distant past were without the capacity to endow the ages with tributes that were unspoken, that their thoughts enrichen us today, and they are a part of the world forte and the world treasure house of knowing God and knowing these various elements that comprise the Godhead. And what a delight this is, because it enriches our own capacity to retrieve, to bring back into this present moment something of the wonders of God's love. What an abomination it would be if all that we today can be was lost as potential because it was not recorded in the sacred fires of Akasha. And what is Akasha? But the memory of the eternal perfection that abides still this moment in the atmosphere of this planet, as in every little cube of cosmic space in all eternity. Do you think, and what we say is not a preachment, it is a release of the living Word that creates the fiber of our very bones. From the archives of the great white brotherhood, where there is no shadow of turning, where the cosmic momentums of those who have victoriously become overcomers of their own foibles and problems, the ephemeral, temporary turnings of mankind's own activities caught in the nets of worldly illusion, have produced and then have, by the miracle of the divine intervention, released themselves from the skeins of darkness that sought to bind them as by root weeds deep into the heart of the earth, so that they could not move, being root-bound by tradition, being hide-bound by tradition, being overcome by the vicissitudes of life. All of this they overcame. And they released that divine seed with its internal vibrancy of cosmic action from the center of their being until all turmoil and all struggle ceased and the seed swelled in the heart of the earth by invisibility, through invisibility, deep in the heart of the earth. The penetration of the magnificent rays of the sun went down, and then the little stalk came up, the green shoot of the first manifestation, a manifestation of nature like unto the embryonic manifestation of man or woman born of God within the womb of matter, a tiny babe. This tiny babe, and we were all that, was destined to produce the miracle of the ages in consciousness. It was no great victory to the Father, who created worlds without end turning in space, to be able to produce the miracle of Himself in His beloved Son, Christ Jesus. And then to be able to say to the world, "This is my beloved Son," and leave it go at that, while denying all of the other sons of God that He also created the opportunity of partaking of the cosmic wafer, the substance of the body of God. "This is my body, which was broken for you," in a true and mystical sense, is the breaking of the loaves, that all might have their divine portion or crumb of identity as a seed fiery spark anchored within their own force field. That there the light that poured down and created the warmth should produce the germinal action of the seed, that the green shoot should come up, that the stalk should unfold, that the flower should appear upon the branches of life, in this case upon the spinal stalk, and that the fragrance of the bloom, from bud to bloom, mind you, would permeate the atmosphere of a planet with the immortality of God, or the immortal sweetness, whereby each soul comes to recognize its own supreme purpose. What a sad event it is that so much of the world, hungering and thirsting after righteousness, cannot be filled because of unbelief. What a tragedy. We may say this, but if we view this age and the crystallization of its concepts as a syndrome of man's failures to recognize God, we can see that the malady is being overlain by media, by television, by books, by the preachments of ignorance, and by the sense of human struggle. And it really doesn't produce a thing. A man is lost in the vacuum of 3.5 billion people upon the planet. when we journeyed into India and the remote parts thereof, when we have traveled in Europe and various other parts of the world, we have been amazed at the similarity, the glaring similarity between people. They're all born. They have 2 eyes and nose, mouth. They look quite a bit alike. There are 144,000 archetypes of humanity in the world. If you look very carefully, you'll observe that these archetypes are very repetitive. You may see it in Colorado Springs. You go over to Calcutta. Outside of a little darkened skin, same faces appear in perhaps a different stature. Because these 144,000 archetypes are based upon Elohimic law, the law of the Elohim of creation. The Elohim, the 7 in all, comprising the divisions of the Godhead into various activities, whereby the being of man manifests. Made a little lower than the angels, yet crowned with more glory. We look around and we ask ourselves, where is the glory? The glory is not in temporal things. And there are ways that one can find God now. And these are not stereotypes. You will find, and if you knew the workings of the cosmic law as it was revealed to Origen of Alexandria, for example, you would be able to unravel some of the scriptural mysteries for yourself. And you'd find it's a great deal more fun than crocheting a bedspread. It's a great deal more pleasure than playing a game of ball. And albeit we involve ourselves in the sports of the world to a degree, we keep ourselves trim according to a degree, these things are for a point. For one does not need to become a sissified or ossified example. One can be, as God has made us all to be, an example of a well-rounded person who has had all of the square corners knocked off. Do you understand? Because life deals us sledgehammer blows at times. Life seems crushing at times. And I think nowhere more crushing than in the realm of understanding or misunderstanding. How easy it is for man to misunderstand the things of the Spirit that are so simple. For example, I find the greatest problem of all to be in our failure to penetrate the facades of mankind. Oh no, I don't want you, and I don't want to myself get involved in trying to look at people with a view to deciphering just what makes them tick. I think this is a great error. What makes them tick in a worldly sense is not what makes them tick in a divine sense with the tick, tick, tick of infinity, which is a contact with the cosmic heartbeat. The little outer signs that we find so similar in all people, these are not the things that we are interested in. And if I were interested in just earning a living, how happy I would be to divest myself of the garment of just being a spiritual teacher. It would be such a great pleasure to be able to go out and work 8 hours a day and then come home and say, now the day is over. My period of rest is drawing nigh. For we find that as we look ahead, there is only work and more work lying ahead. And we remember the words of God which are so precious to us that came through the Christ. He said, the Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Every one of us, you and me, and I understand this, and I think you understand that I understand it. Interesting phrase, isn't it? All of us have our own work to do. And nowhere is this work more apparent than in a spiritual sense as we seek to unravel the veils that hang between our consciousness. I remember so well, and I speak not from the ivory tower of mere attainment at the top of the stairs, but as one who swings by the grace of God upon a rope, the thread of my life being in His hands. I speak of my own experiences when I scarcely knew as a child what was behind the inner meaning of life. And I speculated as a child speculates, almost as a baby speculates. I pondered upon the meaning of life. And in my childlike way I said, what is life all about? And then an answer came from within myself as I lay on my stomach on a pile of sand, looked at the blue sky, the drifting clouds, and all that I saw before me. I lay on my stomach and I fashioned castles out of sand. I knew that they were temporary sand castles that could be trampled upon by a foot, crushed or washed away. I knew all of this. But as my mind dwelled in the realm of the sand, my little eyes and ears being focused and attuned to just little mortal games, there was another part of me that was far, far away in the blue sky. And when I say this, I jest not. This is not a joke. I knew that I was there at the same time that I knew I was here. Do you understand? I knew there was something in me that had a point of contact with the universe. But my child mind refused to grasp it. The Master said, unless ye become as a little child and enter in, ye cannot know. Can we grasp this principle? The principle of being able to descend to the child level in consciousness. And at the same time, at the same instant, being able to go out with the maturity of the living God that created the cosmic watch with all of its ticking, that created the intricacy of nature, the intricacy of our bodies, our minds, and arranged them, the wafers of creation thinly pressed between the substance of our tissue, our bodies, the musculoskeletal frame, the endocrine system, the gastrointestinal system, all the reptilian systems of the animal kingdom, being the physical chalice that we ourselves wear. And yet, would we be content now at this moment? Would we be satisfied with our physical bodies if there were not also in that physical realm, as a sponge retains both water and air? Would there not then also be a chalice for the mind? Try thinking without a brain. And you see the chalice of the mind, and yet you know within yourself that that brain can do nothing until it is energized by the currents of the soul. Something is there that is greater. Something that has a greater outreach. Something that can contact infinity from the realm of time. Pianists, organists, let us sing that song about time and eternity. I am a child of the light. As we interrupt momentarily our discourse.
Number 199.
We will sing this 7 times.
You
We want to thank all of you for your immediate participation in this song. And we want to remind you of some very important things tonight. The importance of what we may call the simultaneous action of universal spiritual worship. While I agree that it may be folly to worship without the totality of worship that is involved in doing the things which I say, as the Master said. In other words, what I'm saying is, just to be involved with the written word, with the word of devotion, without actually carrying out the written word in our lives, would be a gross error which goes on all over the world. The Master said, they draw nigh unto me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. So as we think tonight of the action that is going on in the world that compels the divine answer, let us think of a little prayer meeting in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, at which the Master Jesus presided with a handful of his disciples. By the flickering light of little primitive lamps, perhaps dipped in primitively and crudely made oil, they conducted an intense period of devotion and contact with the miracle of the first love of God. In other words, they did not feel lost in time. There had been ages before. Some of you do not know, and some of you do know, that there was the land of Lemuria on the west coast, in the west coast region, the Pacific area. And there are very interesting stories to tell about the burning of Lemuria, the destruction of Lemuria, and how it went down, the battles of the priests and religion. I'm not referring to organizations that are near us in time, such as the Catholic Church, when I speak of priests. I'm speaking of the priests of the Sacred Fire who lived in Lemuria and who eventually degenerated, losing contact with their early religious training and contact with their devotions, their lives, and began to live in a physical way, a grasping way and a greedy way, until through neglect the entire continent fell. And out of this fall, the destruction of Lemuria occurred. Then too, in our more recent time prior to the Egyptian civilization, we recall the land of Atla, or Poseidonis, Poseid, or Atlantis, which was nigh the Azores in a physical sense. We recall the capital of Kaifol described by Philos the Tibetan in his book Dweller on Two Planets. Some of us recall these early experiences as though it were yesterday. 12,000 years ago, Atlantis was a part of our world, Kaifol being the capital of Atlantis. This land, through the same cycles of wickedness, the deterioration of man's love for God, bhakti, the devotion of the heart, like a lotus, became extinguished by the mud of human consciousness. Man thought only of criticism. You know, which of you, as Jesus said, by taking thought, could add 1 cubit to his stature? Which of you in this audience tonight would be able, if you wanted to change yourself? Don't you see that I, of necessity, as a teacher of light, cannot afford to care what anyone thinks of what I say or what I do. I must be strictly honest before man and God. Otherwise, my words have no meaning. But because they stem from the criteria of divine experience, they do have meaning, as many of you know, but only by the endowment of God's grace. And so when I speak of Atlantis, you must understand that I speak of experience. For I was there also, as many of you were, as many of mankind were in the past. Our lives consisting not of 70, but of 70 in segments, repeated again and again as oft as needed, that we may learn. For life is not a meaningless jumble cast upon the band of time that, like the light of far-off stars, is merely the light that comes through space, through light years of space, and speaks of a burned-out star that fills an empty socket in space. We are speaking of the continuity of individuality, your individuality. You have lived before. And in your life before, the broken thread of life manifested then and manifested and peeped through the windows of your being as it is doing today. You could not put together a complete chronology of all of your lives. And those who tell you they will give you a life reading of all of your lives may fill you with a lot of bunk that might entertain your mind, and your ego would be fattened thereby, but will never profit your soul, which would better by far dwell in the realm of mastering cosmic law, so that you may be able to live today in a victorious way and not rehearse your experiences of 12,000 years ago as though they have any specific import to your fellow men. They are only important to you. And the evaluation thereof is not performed by the carnal mind, but is performed by the soul, which examines the fruits thereof and thus thrusts upon you the present cosmic opportunity to be able to learn. For you are here to learn. You are here to grasp the cosmic law, that you may be able to live in a masterful way, not as a dominant person over others, but as a dominant person over yourself. If you can rule yourself, you can keep a city, the Bible tells us. But what is the meaning of mastering yourself? Why, I'll tell you. You're just three people rolled into one, in that way of looking at it. You have a physical body, and really and truly, that physical body doesn't mean any more than a mustard seed. It can mean a lot if you keep it in good repair. It's a nice vehicle. It's a horse on which you ride. But what is more important than your body is the manifestation of you as a person. You are not your body. Your body is the house in which you live. Your body is a sponge. And what does a sponge soak up? The sponge soaks up your emotional body, the body of feelings. What is it that gets hurt when someone you meet doesn't speak to you on the street? God? Can you imagine? Can you imagine that God is going to be hurt because someone didn't recognize you? Of course not. What is hurt is the human ego. And why is it hurt? It is hurt because of the feelings, the crushed feelings. Why they didn't even recognize me, we say. This is a folly energy drain. It puts your energy right down the sink and into the sewer. And if you get angry with this person, the sewer splashes back in your face. Because you're disturbed with people. You have to learn to be absolutely calm, absolutely undisturbed, no matter what anybody says or thinks about you, even if you know it. And that's a very hard thing to do until you come to a certain place. When after a while you suddenly decide, why, I have so much energy. Reminds me of my little girl, Moira. She stood up in the bathtub one night, recently taking a bath. She looked down at her body, and she said, why, I've got a new body. I just came down not long ago from heaven. She had just begun to realize that. Do you see? Why, of course she did. And we all did. That's why Jesus, who taught re-embodiment all the time he was on earth, and so did St. Francis in the public square, Jesus said, when the disciples were sitting around there and having a gab session. Did you ever know they had a gab session? They had a lot of them. They were talking about the old prophecy back in the Scriptures, that Elijah the prophet was going to come once again into the world. What did they mean when they said he was going to come into the world? Just that. He's going to be reborn. And then Jesus looked at them and he said, why, he said, don't you know? Elias has already come. And they did unto him as they would. What is the next scripture? It says, then understood the disciples that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. Don't you remember how Salome danced before the king, you know? And then when she got through, her mother said, ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. So she did. And they cut his head off, the king's command. And they brought John's head up on a platter. Jesus knew about this. John knew about it. And he didn't eat bugs. Says John the Baptist came eating locusts and wild honey. The locust is the carob. The carob pods. It's called St. John's bread. That's what it's called. He ate that and wild honey with it. Tastes pretty good. A lot better than bug juice. We have to understand that these mysteries are plain. Elijah come again. Do you know what was so wonderful about Elijah? Elijah the prophet. He went up into heaven in a chariot of fire. I never knew what that meant when I was a boy. He ascended back to God in a chariot of fire. The very atoms of his body were turned. They became fire. He ascended in that vehicle of infinite fire. And very, very seldom, and I know cosmic laws, you may know jurisprudence, hardly ever in cosmic history does anyone who ever ascends back to God return to this stinking world. That's what it is on the outside. You know that. I think it's pretty nice, but it's still stinking compared to heaven. You don't believe it, go over to India. When we flew over Bombay, as we landed in Bombay, the stink of India came up through the bottom of the airplane. And when we got out, we knew it. Poor old George Lancaster and John Anderson, they stood there in Bombay, India. Early in the morning, they'd been up for probably 15 to 20 hours, and they were hungry, and they brought birds' eggs to us. And they put them on a platter, and the men who served them wiped our chairs and the floor underneath the chairs with a rag, a dirty rag, and then they put the rag on the plates and polished them. But after we returned back to Bombay to fly to the United States once again, we thought it looked like heaven. because the rest of India was even worse. Yes, we have a stinking world here, whether we know it or not. But we don't have to get messed up with it. We can keep our consciousness above the fly line of human despairs. We can raise our consciousness up toward God, thank heaven. And we can see for this world and envision for this world a new heaven and a new earth. Because man today has not, in his own vision of heaven, the correct interpretation. Heaven can be an amplification of all the good things that we see in this world, and most people don't know that. Eye has not seen, nor has ear heard, nor has entered into the mind of man the things which God has prepared for them that love Him, who are the called according to His purpose. Now, in this idea and concept of love of God, we may say, well, how can we love God more? I want to tell you tonight that if you do not love your fellow man whom you have seen, you can never correctly love God whom you have not seen. And therefore we start right here, loving humanity, free from all the degradation and stench of mortality, carnality, and the frustrations of this world. What a magnificent place this is if you view it as a schoolroom from which you can graduate and step up the stairs step by step through the initiatory process to where you have dominion over yourself. Well, you say that doesn't matter. That matters completely, because in this sponge we're talking about, saturated with the water element, the feelings, and in this sponge saturated with air, the air referencing the mind, and the water element referencing the feelings, through the mastery of thought and feeling, man is able to attain immortality because he attains God-likeness. You never saw the Master Jesus, that he was not master of the situation. In the total picture of his life, he walked on the water. He commanded the elements. He healed the sick. He raised the dead. He was conscious of his Father, which is in heaven. You can be that. He doesn't say to you, get away from me. I'm holier than you are. I don't care anything about you because you have such a puny mind. Your feelings are so basically ignorant. No, nothing like that from Jesus. He says, come unto me, all ye that are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. So the world today tries to make a bromide out of it. You know what a bromide is? This is a headache powder. What they want to do with the teachings of Jesus is keep repeating them. In our movies that are now current in the world, they will try to create a division in your consciousness by showing you a wicked, wicked scene and then having the Blessed Virgin statue standing nearby. Or they'll take a holy temple somewhere and they'll show a picture of desecration. This is to create a dichotomy in the mind, a split, a division. People are not smart enough to catch the trends of the dark powers of the world that dwell in high places. I'm not speaking of altitude. They try to create a division in our mind by riding piggyback on something that either has value or has none. They try to identify objects together and confuse us. The issue is very, very simple and very, very beautiful. You know something? Have you ever seen the Indian rope trick? How many here have ever seen the Indian rope trick? Well, that makes it very good, because I didn't see it either. But I heard about it. And sometimes hearing about it from a reliable source is just as good as seeing. Of course, I'd still like to see it sometime. I did see snake charmers. But I'll tell you about the Indian rope trick. A small boy, 11 or 12 years old, stands there with this great fakir, or this supposed master of the occult legerdemain. So he takes a rope and he throws it up into the sky. Probably goes 50 or 75 feet. And the rope becomes just as stiff as a board. And as soon as it's stiff as a board, the little boy takes a hold of it. And then hand over hand he keeps climbing until he gets to the top of the rope. Then the master down below snaps his fingers. And the boy disappears from the top of the rope, and the rope falls to the ground. It's like an old shell game. You know, I think you could buy the heart of the world with that trick. I've often wondered why they don't come over here to America and perform it in the public square in Madison Square Garden or something. Put it on television. Enough people have seen it, God knows, that it is not an illusion, it really happens. As many other miraculous things happen. So we live in a time of miracles. There's quite a few people that can perform miracles also, but who won't? And the question is why? It becomes a matter of cosmic ethic. It just so happens that to me, the miracle that I deem the highest is a changed life. This is a life that is free from its chains. Chains and change. If you stop and think about it right now, I don't care who you are in this room, unless you have a knowledge of your God presence, unless you understand the mysteries of your being in a complete way, there is little doubt in my mind that you have some chains forged around you. But by a like token, there is little doubt in my mind that those chains can be shattered through the process of cosmic change, that you can evolve, that you are evolving, that you will evolve, and that when you evolve, you will find that many of the things which I say to you tonight, which may seem strange to you at first, are very natural. I remember the old story of the boy who was 17, who said at the age of 17 that he was amazed at the ignorance of his father. He said he was simply amazed still more when he got to be 21 at how much his father had learned in 4 years. And so, if we are willing to lose our sense of sophistication regardless of how much we know or think we know, if we are willing to apprentice ourselves in greater measure to the Godhead, and to tie ourselves willingly to the great white brotherhood, to get on the bandwagon, in other words, with the masters in this age, if we're willing to be taught, if we're willing to allow ourselves to become involved in the great divine experiment, in the cosmic adventure, then heaven has a valuable lesson to teach us. For example, much of the early embryonic teachings of the Great White Brotherhood are set down already in what we call the Keepers of the Flame. Did most of you know that this organization has a fraternity in it? Like the Knights of Columbus or the Masons or any secret order, our fraternity has teachings. And these teachings reveal the early experiments in cosmic living, whereby your whole mind and being can shift from a carnal mind to a mind that is open to God like a great funnel. And when this happens, you're going to be very happy. Those of you who are not keepers of the flame, who are not involved in our weekly pearls of wisdom, who have never read a pearl of wisdom, who don't know what it is, can have the opportunity without money and without price to do so. We don't charge anything for our teachings. We send them all over the world to thousands and thousands of people. We don't ask you to come up here and make a public display of yourself, as that blessed man Billy Graham does. No, we're not graham crackers. All we ask is that you avail yourself of what God has already placed in store for you through the teachings. Now, how many of you receive the pearls of wisdom in this room? What do you think of the pearls of wisdom? How many of you that are receiving the pearls of wisdom do not want to be without them again? Put your hands up. That's why you're on there. And what are they? They are a weekly letter from an ascended master such as Saint Germain, Mother Mary, Paolo Veronese, or Paul the Venetian, or any of the great masters, El Moria, in the other room, hanging over the fireplace. You know, one of the strangest and weirdest things I ever heard in my life is the fact that people think that these people are dead. We might be dead here, but they're not dead. It's a cinch. And they don't have a great deal of trouble in communicating with us. And what they say is extremely valuable because you're not hearing from a human being at all. But Christ was here on earth. Remember that. He was here in the flesh. Great avatars have been engaged in human activities. Do you think that St. Joseph was not the father of quite a few children? Do you think that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had only Jesus? She had several other children later. Did you know that? Jesus had brothers and sisters. When the truth is really known, the whole generative and regenerative process comes under direction. And it is God's experiment of joy to the world. God is giving us the opportunity of finding ourselves right here in the veil of time. And I'm going to tell you something. I was just reading a book the other day about the late Bishop Pike and Arthur Ford, the great spiritualist medium. And the book said that right now, it says, two souls that are very popular in the astral world are the late Arthur Ford and Bishop Pike, who are very, very interesting to the inhabitants of the astral realm. I can see that. They would be. I remember the time I was speaking out against some of the things Bishop Pike was saying, for although he had some very good qualities, he also had some very bad ones that drove his son to suicide. Some of you may not know that. So some woman got up, she defended Bishop Pike to the nth degree in the audience, and she said, "How dare you say anything about that great and good man?" So I said to Moria, "I'm really on the spot. I'm on a bed of spikes right now, and please get me off of it." And Moria says, "You just tell that woman that Pike's Peak is not the summit." He's really quick with the rapier thrust of his mind. It's like the time I was up in San Francisco and over near Berkeley, and there was a young man there who was a draft dodger. And, of course, we have some of them here too, you know, and they're all good friends. But the point is, this was a draft dodger who didn't like me. And he'd heard how many good things had been done through me, the great work that God had done, and God did it. But the point is, he turned to me and he said, "Well," he said, "if you're so good," he said, "how come you're left here on earth?" I said, "Moria, help." Again, the Master Moria told me, he said, "Just tell him," he said, "that God doesn't skim off all the cream." That was what Moria wanted me to do. The young man had quite an experience afterward. I won't even go into that. But what we are concerned with in the main is bringing the truth to people, the truth that will free people and liberate them so they can find God. If you can scratch in the air and pull the air apart and see what's behind the air, why, it looks just like a backdrop in one of these stage props. You know what I mean? It looks pretty real and pretty solid. If you bump your head against a stone wall, it hurts. But if you really understand that it's all an illusion of the mind, and that behind the illusion there is God, you will understand, as my wife said this morning, which I thought was very interesting. She says, you know the meaning of the word atom? I said, no, what's atom exactly? She said, well, atom, she says, is alpha to omega. And I thought that was very good. A, alpha, T, to omega, O-M. That's the way it goes. It's real interesting, isn't it, really? And so we see that in simple little things, there are great lessons to be learned. One time I asked God, I said, what does the word government mean? He said, that's rather simple. He said, the G stands for God. And the O-V-E-R stands for over, M-E-N, over men. And he said that those to whom authority is given in the world, like the great politicians, you know, Richard, poor Richard, and quite a few of the other politicians, you know, these are really supposed to be God's overmen. You see what I mean? And so they are. But thank heaven for 7-Eleven, because one of these days it's going to be 12. And when it becomes 12, man will come into his majority, which will mean that we'll grow up. Right now, sometimes we act like children. And it may be a happy game or a game of terror. But whichever it is, we have something to look forward to that's better. And that means a great deal to me. Doesn't it mean a lot to you? Just the idea that behind this screen we can paw it open, you see, and poke a little hole in it. You know how you stand, sometime you go by one of these places where they have all the boards built up, you know, and the kibitzers come along, they finally put a knothole in it, and they call it Kibitzer's Corner, and you'll come along, you'll see a whole bunch of people peeping through these different knotholes at the construction, while it's under construction. Well, don't have the idea somehow or other that right now God isn't constructing a new world just because this one's falling apart. Because He is. And He's constructing a new you, too. Only it helps a great deal if you know it. See, He can do it without you knowing it. But He prefers that you know it, because when you work with Him, you swim with the current. When you work against Him, you're swimming upstream. And that's what a lot of people are doing. So shall we gather at the river? We will sing together number 110. We're going to sing this together as we bring to a close our Sunday evening dissertation. We have so much more to tell you that this is continued next Sunday. We've been at it for a while, you know. Please stand.
Beloved Cyclopea, God will sing I, thy radiant light now floods the earth from realms on high. We love thee, we bless thee, beloved Elohim. We now find in mankind the source to whom we can begin. To magnetize and vitalize the self we know, releasing joy from mercy's flame of love. O Elohim, the perfect silent melody, O blessed Cyclopea, the perfect eye and perfect ear are thine desire. now place to all, oh, make it live. Release, increase, acceptance of thy every gift, for such cooperation would all live. Oh, make us struggle free from wrongs and life. Oh, help us, Cyclopea, make things right. Expanded now to every crowd, Virginia dear, thy ray of vision breathes serene, dissolves all fear. To others, our brothers, and all that we pass by, blaze to us and through us the comfort that our God is nigh. Release the music of the spheres in sweetest sound, that everyone may hear the world around. All mankind's attention to God's heavenly plan, till by the Elohim since earth began. O heavenly friend of light and love, we all now free, draw all our earth and all upon it unto thee. It's thrilling, joy-filling to hear about her birth, the story of glory, the first creation of our earth. Thy oceans bright of cosmic light that round her swirl, will bring again perfection to our world. O Cyclopea, Elohim, we now implore, assistance never come to earth before. Gifts from our Son, most holy one, from earth we call, of blessings only thy heart claim, and Elohim all, archangels and masters and cosmic beings free, world Savior and David's, all heavenly hosts now unto thee. The Sun God and Sun Goddess of our system dear, send envoys of God's love to bless thee here. To Helios and Vesta for all thou hast done, all blessings from the Sun behind the sun.
Please be seated. I'm going to shortly sign off for the night. And I want to say a few things before I do, namely that you're all invited to a delicious little repast after the service is over. And following that, those who wish to stay, it's all your option, may have a question and answer period with me in the family room. This is a customary Sunday evening function. This is your opportunity to ask questions and receive answers. It is a God-filled opportunity to those who desire it. But above all, let your questions be sincere, bordering on those things that your heart longs to understand. And then we can produce a greater miracle in your life by giving you the truth that makes you free. So now I'm going to enlist you in a brief meditation or mantra. We will use the Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugantim Pushnivardhanam Urva Rukamiva Bandit and so on. All right, you got it. I'm not going to say it all. So if you will sit straight in your chairs with your spines erect, your hands placed in your lap in this position, don't hold anything. We will do this together, for long life has been assured those who practice this mantra faithfully. And it is an Indian mantra that we learned through India. Together. Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanam Mrityor Mokshya Mamritat. Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanam Mrityor Mokshya Mamritat. Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanam Mrityor Mokshya Mamritat. Om Trayambakam Yajamahe
Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat, Om Trayambakam, Yejamahe, Sugandim Pushtivaranam, Uruvarukamiva Bandhanam, Mrejor Mukshya Mamritat. Om Namo Narayanaya, 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 Om Namo Narayanaya.
The sign of the heart and the head and the hand to you. May the peace of your presence abide with you, wherever you are, wherever you go. The glorious peace of your presence flows through days of service and nights of rest. The peace of your presence keeps you blessed. The sign of the heart and the head and the hand to you, in the name of the entire spirit of the great white brotherhood, upon the great cross of cosmic peace, of the Christ, the Buddha, and the momentum of the Holy Spirit upon this earth. The Lord be with thee, and with thy spirit. Peace be unto you. We will begin now with the first question of the evening. I want to point out to you that whereas we very seldom avoid a question, we reserve the right to do so when in the interest of all concerned this is thought advisable by the Master. You may ask any question pertaining to the well-being, the spiritual well-being of mankind or yourself that is within the province of our ability to answer. And because you don't know how much we can answer, this almost includes anything, and we'll tell you in case we can't answer it. Yes.
If a person had completed the balancing of a large percentage of his karma and he decided to come back into embodiment, would he be running the danger of making more bad karma?
Definitely. Everyone is under the law, and there are no exceptions. Were God himself to incarnate from the pure state of the Godhead and take a physical form, if he were to dwell here and mingle with people, he would be as much subject to his own laws as any of us. However, it is highly unlikely that if he did manifest as an avatara or an incarnation of himself in form, or the incarnation of someone who had overcome, it is highly unlikely that that one would be entangled in karmic recompenses quickly, as would most of the human race, who are more prone and subject by reason of the momentums that are within themselves to fall, this being an easier thing to do than to rise. It's always true that one can go downstairs faster than they can go upstairs. And so we all have to look to our laurels and see to it that no man may steal our crown. The world is full of circumstances that conspire against a man's leading a good life in the eyes of God. And so in order to lead a good life, it is most important that we have fellowship with those who are already devoted to cosmic truth and cosmic love, because then we are more apt to be successful. If we mingle with those who mock God and laugh at him, those who have no real faith in a spiritual goal, there is a tendency for us to absorb the negative magnetism of these people. And so through associating with people of a godly intent, we may build a momentum of godliness ourselves. At least we build a greater momentum of it through the natural process of assimilating or absorbing the radiation of people. A lot of people are not aware of the influence of others upon their life, and therefore they mingle with the wrong kind of people and wonder why they feel so bad. So by mingling with the right kind of people, the buoyancy, the love, the joy, and the peace of God may come to our soul, and eventually we ourselves will become self-regenerating. You understand what I mean? In other words, we won't be any longer toasting our shins on someone else's fires, but we will be creating our own fires by the currents and the power that God put within ourselves. And then others will toast their shins on ours. Another question? Let's try to have someone that hasn't asked a question, please. Yes, Mr. Beasy.
What is the place of sexuality in marriage?
Well, it's a difficult question. Mr. Beasy has asked, what is the place of sexuality in marriage? There have been many, many answers given to this problem, which primarily is a problem of generation. In other words, without any sex act whatsoever, it would be impossible to produce children. This is how children are produced. And while there has been talk of test tube babies, at the same time, we haven't actually seen it happen. And while I don't doubt that in the past this probably did happen, at the present time, the role of sex in human life, as envisioned by God, was primarily for procreative purposes. Now, of course, the Kundalini fires, or the sleeping serpentine force, which is in the base of the human spine, or the spinal chakras, is usually kept there for a prolonged period of time by anyone who is wise, rather than to try to awaken the sleeping Kundalini. And I will explain why. If you awaken the sleeping Kundalini before you have refined, and take note, before you have refined your spiritual nature in its own outward manifestation, in other words, as long as you have the seeds of desire in the chakras and around the chakra centers on the spinal column, by awakening prematurely the Kundalini force, you may actually kindle or enlarge or magnify the evil that's in you, using the spiritual power of the serpentine force to bring forth the sleeping giant or the genie from the Kundalini realm. And as you do this, you will energize negative forces in yourselves more than positive. In some cases, premature awakening of the Kundalini will produce insanity, and is the most dangerous thing unless done under the direction of a real, genuine master. However, after a person has reached a stage in their spiritual development where it is possible for them to be free or relatively free from desires, then, of course, the kindling of the Kundalini force and the raising of it up the spinal column will energize only the good, because only the good will exist there. Now, the role of human sexuality has been primarily used for entertainment by mankind. they enjoy sensual feelings, and the sensual feelings seem to mean more to them in many cases than the divine feelings. And there is a definite war between thy seed and the serpent's head. Thou shalt bruise his heel, but he shall bruise thy head, being the word that was spoken by God to Adam, or Adam Kadmon, the early man. And so we must be very careful with the two-edged sword of sex. Misused, it can bring about our downfall. Properly used, it can elevate us to the heights of opening the third eye by raising the Kundalini force up the spinal column. Now, when we talk about opening the third eye, we're merely talking about the energizing by bringing up the Kundalini up to the third eye and then around the spinal column in the similar manner to Kriya Yoga. We are able, of course, to produce a greater development in a few short years than we would ever anticipate. However, I have always found in my own personal experience that these things will automatically take place as we come into attunement with God. It's like this. I mean, you have God and you in existence. And while there's other people, from a practical standpoint, you have to recognize your own divinity, don't you? You have to recognize that you can be one with God. It doesn't help us that some other person in this room suddenly achieves a oneness with God. That isn't going to help us to achieve it unless we strive to achieve it ourselves, is it? It has to be an individual action. I've always liked to say, in a way, that we have a do-it-yourself kit, and that everybody has to actually provide their own personal contact with God, that Christ may have shown the way as he did, that all the great masters are showing the way as they do, but that we ourselves have to follow them into the regeneration. Now, sex, wrongly used, becomes a force of death that destroys the possibility of life. Rightly used, it will follow divine patterns by ascending up the spine when it's ready to do so. The Kundalini force will flow forth naturally without any instigation on our part if we become spiritually prepared for it by reason of our Christ-like consciousness. Does that make sense to you? Well, the problem is that people have built up momentums on sex as they have on ego. For example, the average businessman today, when you go into him, if you go into his office and you say, "By the way, Mr. Jones, how did you start this business? Please tell me about it." He may have sat there very silent, as I found out in personal experience. He wouldn't talk to you. He had a facade. He had a big wall up against you. But the minute you asked him how he started his business, he'd lean back in his chair, pull out a cigar, and begin puffing away as he started to tell you how very important he was and how glorious he was and how great he was. And he could wax eloquent on this. Well, after a certain amount of time was taken up, your time as well as his, he felt obligated to you and often bought something from you just because of his sense of obligation. But his real sense of obligation was to his ego. And no matter how many times a day you talked about this, he would always be receptive to discuss himself. So we have to realize that this is nothing more than a human momentum, which is a frailty in reality. Because when we have these senses, or a sense rather, of a personal ego, we're kicking out God. So sex momentums are no different. They're no different at all than ego momentums. There's all kinds of ego momentums. Some people might call it ego trips, you know. And then again, in addition to ego trips, you have sex trips. And you have all kinds of trips. Sex is a little bit more glamorous to people because it involves the titillation of the physical senses. In other words, you might say that people like to be tickled under the chin. You know what I mean? They just enjoy the feeling of being tickled. So, I mean, this really doesn't do anything particular for the soul. In fact, it usually corrodes the soul because when you put your attention on those things, you become very animalistic because it's a very elusive thing we're talking about. Sex enjoyment. In fact, I remember one woman who used to come over here years ago until she got married. And this woman, you're laughing it out of me now. I'm almost forgetting what she said. But this woman that came over here, it seems to me as I recall it, she had had an experience with a man many, many years before she came here in which she had one orgasm, as she put it, in which she was carried away to the very stars. And so we asked her what she was doing now, and she said she was seeking to have that experience once more. And that she had had hundreds and thousands of sex experiences, and without ever recapturing the magic of that moment. And really, that's the mirage on the desert. I mean, it doesn't really do anything for her, except it made her very old looking, and very old feeling, In fact, it tore her whole disposition down. You can see that. Because the premature release of these things and the involvement of a man or a woman in these things constantly without seeking God is really a wasting of one's spiritual energies, because there is tied to the sex in the spine the divine seed. And it's called the tree of life, on which dwells the 12 manner of fruits that are fulfilling the manner of the 12 months. So you see, as long as a man retains control or relative control over these forces, he is able to enrich in himself spiritually. But as he keeps on expelling all these forces out into the world and not retaining control over it, he becomes a victim, a weakened victim of life. Do you understand this to a degree, what I'm talking about? Well, you know this, that all athletes today are cautioned by their trainers to be very careful to have no sex experiences before they engage in conflict. Because as a rule, if they have any form of human emission, it's a weakening of their being. Does that make sense to you? They keep weakening themselves all the time. So it's really better to keep the mind pure and dwelling upon God, because then you can turn the sex energy in yourself into creative energy, because that is exactly what it is. Sex energy is creative energy. You can use it to create a beautiful picture. You can use it to sculpt a statue. You can use it to enrich in your life. You can use it for all kinds of wonderful, wonderful things. But if you dissipate it unnecessarily, as we learn in the story of Onan, why it says Onan was spilling his seed on the ground, and it says the Lord struck him dead. This was quite a story in the Old Testament. If people just keep on going this way, they have a tendency eventually to get old before their time, and they are not creative. When you become creative, you learn how to harness the sex energy by turning it into light through the spiritual eye. And at any age, you can regenerate your body. Your body can become virile, strong, powerful. Your mind is turned into a tremendous mind. You can reach anywhere in the universe and grab knowledge from God, because you're using the energy properly. You understand what I'm talking about? Used improperly, it's a two-edged sword that keeps you away from the tree of life. And the tree of life is, in some senses, is the spinal column, you see. And the chakras that are on the tree of life are the fruits of the tree of life. And these whirl, you see. They're called by Ezekiel the wheels within wheels. And the turning of these giant wheels within your consciousness really produce magnificent action that draws from the cosmos the divine power and centers it in yourself. You see, the minute you start throwing it out into human dissipations, you lose it. You become a dried up fruit. You cast down to the ground. You become cast down to the ground, and the energy and sap is out of the tree of life. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm trying to answer your question. It's a very difficult question. It's a little embarrassing to me to answer, because I don't like to talk so plainly. But I can't see any point in telling you these things without making it plain, without giving you plainness of speech. I can't see that I can produce any value. It's a thing we have to be careful of. Properly used, it might be all right. I would rather see people married and have a happy home and have children and all of that than I would to see them single if they burn with desire, as St. Paul said. If they're in a condition where they need marriage, then let them seek a companion who will live kindly and decently under the eyes of God. You understand me? But if they can live and devote their lives as the saints did, completely and wholly to God, and we have many such men and women all together here at our retreat, then of course this is possible. Some of us here are married, and some of us are not. We don't really get jealous of each other's position. Yes.
Well, would it seem that this creative energy is one of the basic sustaining forces of the universe?
It's God's energy. It's God's energy that makes the baby. And you have to have the negative and the positive, the male and the female, in order to bring it together. Otherwise, the egg is unfertile. You understand that?
Well, the reason I said that is that, didn't you say that sex energy is really creative energy?
That's what it is. It's that simple. Use it for sex and waste it completely, just for physical intercourse. You destroy yourself eventually. I don't mean to imply that one or two contacts of this kind is going to suddenly dry you up and you're going to blow away. You all know better than that. But it still is something to be very carefully guarded, and one should use it very carefully. To use it for entertainment or just physical, personal happiness is sometimes very dangerous, especially where you don't give God any glory at all. I mean, all you're living, you're just a kind of a cozy little kitten to curl up. You know what I mean?
Is it true to say that this creative energy is an energy behind all of life, not just behind the human sexual part of it?
For your information, it was sex energy, which really means sacred energy. That's what it means. It's sacral, sacred energy. That's on the altar of God. That's the power by which God created the worlds. He framed the worlds. He made the sun, the stars, all the stars, the moon, everything was created. Our bodies, everything was made by the sacred energy. That's why it's so dangerous to misuse it, and so very constructive to properly use it. Yes.
In Scripture, there's a passage that says, "Be ye not conformed to this world,
But be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." Yes.
that ye may prove what is the will of God, good, acceptable, and perfect." And I was wondering how you view that, what you see as the world, and what you see in essence that we should not be conformed to.
There is a world mind, and the world mind is like the fashions of the time, like the height of a woman's dress, like the color of a man's necktie or the width of his necktie or his suit. Every time in which we live, the world has had conformity to its fashions and styles. But more than that, it has created lifestyles and a carnal mind that judges all things according to the things of the flesh. As we see it, when it says you be not conformed to this world, it refers to the conformity of a man to the fashions of the world, which pass away. Instead, let that man be renewed by the renewing of his mind in the eternal values that are established by Jesus Christ and by all the great masters and by God himself. Only by dwelling in the mind of Christ, only by allowing that mind to permeate our consciousness, only by becoming one with God in thought, in word, in deed, can we truly do this. Yet this act need not be an actual overt act to the world. While some may view it so from the world position, deeming any man that elects to follow or pursue a spiritual path an enemy, we must not ourselves be involved in a sense of enmity, but a feeling of love. Yet we must obey the ordinance of God that clearly has stated, as the man has quoted, "Be ye not conformed to this world." In matters of preference, having set our hand to the plow, we must plow a straight furrow and do our best. We must not have too high expectations for our own self-righteousness, but rather allow the righteousness of God to dwell in us, bodily, totally, so that God may live through us, and we through his consciousness, our mind being endowed and unified through the Christ mind. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm very sorry that I have to bring this question and answer period to a close, and I ask God's blessing upon you all. You may remain here if you wish.